My ex-wife cheated and left me. Now she's begging for a chance after seeing me with someone else. Hello, read it. I used to think life was predictable. You put in the effort, make the right choices, and things work out the way they're supposed to. That's what we're taught, isn't it? Hard work leads to success. Love leads to happiness. Loyalty keeps people by your side. But life doesn't care about fairness. Sometimes you do everything right, and it still falls apart in your hands. And sometimes, the person you trust the most is the one who betrays you. My name is Daniel Foster, and I was 35 when I realized my life wasn't my own anymore. Not in the way I had imagined. Not in the way I had spent 15 years building it to be. The worst part about betrayal isn't the pain, though it is excruciating. It's the realization that the life you thought was real was nothing more than an illusion. That you were the only one fighting to keep it alive. For 15 years, I had been married to Julia, my high school sweetheart, the woman I had believed was my soulmate. We had the kind of relationship that people envied. Or at least, that's how it looked from the outside. We had built a stable life together. A home in the suburbs, well-paying jobs, a social circle filled with dinner parties and weekend getaways. Everything had followed the script of what a happy, successful marriage should look like. But reality is never as perfect as it seems. At first, the changes were subtle. A little more distance, a little less warmth. Julia had always been social, always loved being the center of attention, and I had never minded. She was the light in the room, the one who drew people in. I was more grounded, more focused on building a future for us, making sure we had the kind of life we had always dreamed about. I worked hard, putting in the extra hours, making sacrifices, all so we could have the security that I knew mattered in the long run. Maybe that was my first mistake, thinking that security was what she wanted. The first warning signs were easy to dismiss. Late nights at work, new friends I had never met, plans that never seemed to include me. When I asked about them, she brushed it off with a laugh, told me I was overthinking, that I needed to relax. And I believed her. Why wouldn't I? We had built a life together. We had history, and history meant something, didn't it? I told myself that all marriages went through phases, that the distance was just temporary, that she would come back to me. I tried harder, planned more date nights, asked her about her day, tried to reconnect. But every effort was met with indifference. Sometimes I caught her looking at me, as if she were already gone, as if she were just waiting for the right moment to say it out loud. The moment came on an ordinary night, in the most ordinary way. I had come home late from work, exhausted, my mind still occupied with numbers and deadlines. Julia was in the shower, and her laptop was open on the kitchen counter. I wasn't looking for anything. I had never been the kind of man to snoop, to dig through messages or check phone logs. I had never needed to. Until that night, the email was still open. A conversation, one I wasn't meant to see. It wasn't just messages. It was intimacy, familiarity, inside jokes that I wasn't a part of. It wasn't just physical. That would have almost been easier. This was worse. This was love. I don't remember how long I stood there, staring at the screen, my breath coming in short, uneven gasps. A part of me still wanted to believe there was some explanation, some misunderstanding. But there wasn't. The words were right there in black and white. When Julia finally emerged from the bathroom, her hair damp, her skin glowing from the heat of the shower, she looked at me, then at the laptop, and she sighed. Not in panic, not in regret, but in something that almost resembled annoyance. As if I had made things inconvenient by finding out. I haven't been happy for a long time, she said. That was it. No he parlé. No te has. Just a simple statement, as if it justified everything. I wish I could say I raged, that I shouted, that I demanded answers. But I didn't. I just stood there, feeling the weight of 15 years crash down on me all at once. I had been fighting for something she had already given up on. I had been holding on to a dream that no longer existed. The divorce was quick. I didn't fight for the house. What was the point? It was just walls and furniture, filled with memories that had rotted from the inside out. I moved into a one-bedroom apartment, a far cry from the home we had built together. At first, it felt like I was suffocating in that tiny space, the silence pressing in on me like a weight I couldn't shake. Grief doesn't just come from death. It comes from loss, from the slow, agonizing realization that the life you thought was real had already died long before you noticed. I stopped answering calls from friends, stopped going out. Work became my only refuge, the only place where I didn't have to think about the emptiness that had taken root in my chest. I wanted to hate her. I wanted to scream, to curse her name, to drown myself in anger, because anger would have been easier than this aching numbness. But the truth is, I couldn't even summon that much emotion. All I felt was exhausted. I drifted through life like a ghost for months. Days blurred together, nights stretched endlessly. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't find the energy to care about anything. People told me I would move on, that time would heal it, that one day I'd look back and realize it had been for the best. At the time, I thought they were full of shit. But time has a way of proving you wrong. It started small, deciding to go for a run instead of drinking myself into a stupor, cooking an actual meal instead of ordering another round of takeout, saying yes when a friend invited me out instead of making another excuse. I didn't realize it at the time, but little by little, I was coming back to life. What I didn't know then was that my story wasn't over. In fact, it was only just beginning. Pain has a way of settling into your bones. It becomes a quiet companion, something you carry with you in the empty spaces of your life, in the long silences of the night, in the way the world feels just a little dimmer than it used to. I had lived with it for months, drowning in it, letting it consume me in a way I never thought possible. At first, I thought I would never recover. How could I? Everything I had built, everything I had believed in, had crumbled in my hands. I had spent 15 years as Julia's husband, 15 years as one half of a partnership I thought would last forever. And then, in the span of one night, that identity had been stripped from me. I wasn't a husband anymore. I wasn't part of a we. I was just me, and I had no idea who that was supposed to be. I lost myself for a while. In the aftermath of the divorce, I moved through my days in a haze. I went to work, I came home. I ate because I had to, not because I cared. I ignored calls, ignored invitations, ignored everything that reminded me that life was still happening around me. My apartment felt like a waiting room, temporary, sterile, meaningless. I would sit in the quiet at night, staring at the walls, replaying every moment, every conversation, every mistake. Could I have done something differently? Had there been a moment where I could have changed the course of things? But there was no answer. And even if there was, it didn't matter. Julia had moved on, and eventually I had to as well. The shift didn't happen all at once. It was slow, almost imperceptible at first. A decision, one day, to take a different route home from work. A moment of hesitation before stepping into a gym, before deciding that I had nothing left to lose. The first few times, I felt ridiculous, out of place, weak, but I kept going. And somewhere between the weights and the exhaustion, I started to feel something other than pain. I started eating better, cooking real meals instead of relying on takeout. I forced myself to go out when friends invited me, even when I didn't feel like it, even when the thought of socializing felt exhausting. Some nights, I would sit at a bar with people I had known for years and feel like a stranger in my own skin. But I stayed. I listened. I reminded myself what it felt like to be part of the world again. And then one night I met her. Her name was Claire. I wasn't looking for anyone. Hell, I wasn't even ready for anyone. But life doesn't wait for you to be ready. Sometimes it just throws people into your path when you least expect it. It was a group setting, one of those nights where I had reluctantly agreed to go out with some old friends. Claire was a friend of a friend, someone I hadn't met before. She was different from Julia in every way. Where Julia had been poised, controlled, always aware of appearances, Claire was effortless. She had a way of making people feel comfortable like they had known her forever. And she had a laugh, loud, unapologetic, the kind that made people turn their heads. I didn't think much of it at first. I wasn't in the mindset for anything serious, and she wasn't pushing for anything either. But that night, for the first time in a long time, I found myself actually enjoying a conversation. I wasn't faking a smile. I wasn't pretending to be okay. I didn't expect to see her again, but a few weeks later, life had other plans. I ran into her at a coffee shop, both of us waiting in line, both pretending not to notice the awkwardness of recognizing someone outside the context of where you first met them. She smiled at me, and I smiled back. It was simple, easy. We started talking more after that. First casually, then more frequently. Coffee turned into late-night conversations, into dinners that didn't feel like dates, but also didn't feel like nothing. It wasn't complicated. It wasn't rushed. It was just nice. I didn't tell her everything at first. She knew I had been married before, but I didn't dump the full weight of my past on her shoulders. I wasn't ready, and I didn't think she deserved to carry that burden. But something about being around her made me feel lighter. For the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't constantly thinking about Julia. I wasn't measuring my life by what I had lost. I was just living. But the past has a way of creeping up on you when you least expect it. One night, Claire and I had gone out with some friends. It was an easy evening, filled with laughter, with drinks, with conversation that flowed effortlessly. As the night wound down, we found ourselves walking together, just the two of us, the city quiet around us. The air was crisp, the kind of cool that felt refreshing rather than cold. There was something peaceful about it, about the way the world felt still. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Then I turned a corner and saw her. Julia. She was standing outside a restaurant, her phone in her hand, laughing at something someone had said. She looked the same, as if time hadn't touched her the way it had touched me, as if she hadn't spent months unraveling, questioning everything like I had. Maybe she hadn't. Maybe, for her, it had never been that hard. I would have walked past her without a second thought. I should have. I was done with that chapter of my life. But then she looked up, and everything changed. Her eyes met mine, and for a second, just a second, I saw something I hadn't seen in a long time. She wasn't expecting to see me, and she definitely wasn't expecting to see me with someone else. For months, I had been the one drowning, the one picking up the pieces of a life she had shattered. I had assumed she had moved on without a second thought, that she had never looked back. But in that moment, standing under the glow of the city lights, I saw it. A flicker of something I never thought I would see from her again. Regret. For months, Daniel had convinced himself that Julia was nothing more than a closed chapter in his life. A part of his past that no longer held weight, no longer had the power to touch him. He had spent endless nights forcing himself to believe that she had walked away without hesitation, without regret, without ever glancing over her shoulder. And maybe she had. Maybe, in those first few months, she had been too preoccupied with her new life, her new relationship, her newfound freedom to ever wonder what had become of the man she left behind. But now, standing under the city lights, Daniel realized something unsettling. Julia had moved on, but not in the way he had assumed. The flicker of shock in her expression was brief, so quick that most people wouldn't have noticed it, but he had. And buried beneath that momentary surprise was something deeper, something far more telling. Regret. It wasn't just a casual glance. It wasn't just mild curiosity about the woman at his side. It was something rawer, something unspoken, yet undeniable. She wasn't expecting to see him, and she definitely wasn't expecting to see him looking happy. For months, he had carried the weight of his own grief, convinced that he was the only one suffering, the only one still trying to make sense of the wreckage. But now, for the first time he saw it, she had looked back. Maybe not right away. Maybe not with the same depth of agony he had endured. But somewhere in the months that had passed, something had shifted in her. And now, she was standing there, frozen in place, scanning his face as if trying to reconcile the image in front of her with the one she had last seen when she walked away. Claire, oblivious to the silent war raging inside of him, gently touched his arm, grounding him in the present. He forced himself to breathe, to push the past back where it belonged. Julia was still staring, but he refused to give her the satisfaction of knowing she had unsettled him. Without hesitation, he turned toward Claire, smiling at her, and continued walking. He didn't need to look back to know that Julia was still watching. But the past isn't something that fades away just because you decide it should. The first text came a few days later. Julia wanted to talk. He stared at the message for a long time, thumb hovering over the screen. before finally locking his phone without responding. There was nothing to talk about. She had made her decision, and he had spent too long picking up the pieces of his life to let her pull him back into her orbit. 2 days later, another message arrived. This time, the words were carefully chosen, carrying an undertone of hesitation, something he wasn't used to from her. Julia had never been one to second-guess herself. She had always been sure, always decisive. For her to be reaching out now meant one of two things. Either she had finally come to terms with the reality of what she had done, or she was simply trying to satisfy her own curiosity. Either way, he had no interest in reopening wounds that had only just begun to heal. He deleted the message without responding. He told himself that was the end of it, that she would take his silence as an answer and move on. But the past has a way of creeping in, slipping through the cracks when least expected. A week later, he and Claire had gone out for dinner, a quiet evening in a dimly lit restaurant downtown. The warmth of the atmosphere, the soft hum of conversation, the easy rhythm of laughter between them, it all felt effortless. He wasn't pretending anymore. He wasn't forcing himself to enjoy the moment or pushing away thoughts of Julia. For the first time in a long time, he felt like himself again. And then, as he sipped his drink, the air around him shifted. A presence too familiar, too deeply ingrained in his memory to ignore. Julia had just walked in. She wasn't alone. A man stood beside her, exuding the kind of effortless confidence that Daniel had once resented in others. He was polished, smooth, the type who had never needed to fight for attention. It was simply given to him. And yet, despite his presence, Julia wasn't focused on him. Her gaze had already locked onto Daniel, her expression unreadable, her body stiff as if bracing for something. It should have meant nothing, just another encounter in a city filled with fleeting moments. But he saw it again, that flicker of something behind her eyes. Not anger, not jealousy, something worse. She was performing, even with her date beside her. Even with the carefully crafted facade she wore, she wasn't fully present. Daniel recognized it instantly. The way her laughter came just a second too late. The way her movements felt slightly unnatural. The way her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. She was aware of him, aware of the fact that, for the first time since their divorce, she was the one left wondering instead of him. Claire, either oblivious to the tension or choosing to ignore it, continued their conversation, and Daniel kept his focus on her. Julia was the past, the woman who had made her choices and never looked back. And yet, as he and Claire stood to leave, Julia intercepted him near the entrance. For the first time in months, they stood face to face. She hesitated, her gaze flickering toward Claire before settling back on him. There was something unfamiliar in her expression, uncertainty, hesitation. Julia had always been composed, always in control. But now, she looked like she wasn't sure of what she wanted to say. She shifted slightly, as if searching for the right words, but nothing came. And then, just as quickly as she had approached, she took a step back, her carefully maintained poise snapping into place once more. Without another glance, she turned and disappeared into the restaurant. Daniel should have left it at that. Should have walked out the door with Claire and forgotten about it entirely. But later that night, when he checked his phone, another message was waiting for him. Julia had made a mistake. The past never truly stays buried. The message lingered on Daniel's phone, the 5 words staring back at him long after he had locked the screen. Julia had made a mistake. It was a simple sentence, yet it carried weight it had no right to. He told himself it didn't matter, that it didn't change anything, that it was nothing more than another attempt at pulling him into something he had fought too hard to escape. But despite every rational thought telling him to ignore it, the words remained in the back of his mind, settling into the cracks that had once been scars. For months, she had been a ghost, nothing more than a shadow in his past, a presence that haunted old memories and existed only in the spaces she had once filled. And then, suddenly, she was everywhere, standing across the street, appearing in crowded rooms, slipping into his world as if she had never left. She had been the one to walk away, the one to burn everything to the ground without hesitation. So why now? Why, after all this time, did she suddenly seem to care? He didn't answer. He refused to give her the satisfaction of knowing she had managed to get inside his head. But Julia had never been one to disappear easily. The messages continued over the next few days, carefully spaced, just infrequent enough to avoid feeling desperate, just often enough to ensure she was never truly forgotten. Sometimes, she sent nothing more than a simple question, a vague attempt at conversation. Other times, she let the silence speak for her, waiting to see if he would be the one to break it. He never did. Daniel convinced himself that it was over, that she would eventually give up and move on. He had spent too much time rebuilding himself, too much effort piecing together the fragments of his life after she had shattered them. He wouldn't let her drag him backward. But the past has a way of refusing to stay buried. It was a Friday evening when she finally crossed the line. The day had been long, filled with endless meetings, numbers, and reports, the kind of work that left him drained but kept his mind occupied. By the time he got home, exhaustion had settled deep in his bones, the kind that made even the simple act of unlocking his apartment door feel like a task. It wasn't until he had stepped inside, closing the door behind him, that he felt it, that shift in the air, that familiar presence that sent a sharp wave of unease through his chest. Julia was outside. At first he thought he was imagining it, that he was seeing ghosts, that the weight of everything had finally caught up to him. But when he turned and looked through the small peephole in his door, there she was, standing a few feet away, hands gripping the strap of her purse, shifting her weight slightly, as if trying to decide whether to leave or stay. She wasn't supposed to be here. For a long moment, he did nothing. He stayed where he was, muscles tense, jaw clenched, waiting to see if she would knock. But she didn't. She just stood there, staring at his door, hesitating in a way that felt entirely unlike her. Julia had never been the type to linger. She had always been the one who made the decisions, who walked away without looking back. And yet, she wasn't walking away now. Daniel exhaled slowly, then pulled the door open. She looked up instantly, startled by the sudden movement, her expression flickering between uncertainty and something else, something he couldn't quite define. It was strange seeing her like this, standing in front of him again after all these months. She looked the same, yet different. Her hair was styled the way it always had been, her clothes carefully chosen, her makeup flawless. But there was something missing beneath the surface, something subtle but undeniable. Confidence. For the first time since he had known her, Julia looked uncertain. She had come here for a reason, but now that she was standing in front of him, she didn't seem to know how to say it. Her mouth opened slightly before closing again, her gaze flickering between him and the floor, searching for the right words. He didn't invite her inside. Instead, they stood there in the dim glow of the hallway light. Two people who had once shared everything, now nothing more than strangers connected by the weight of a broken past. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was quieter than he remembered, lacking the sharp edges it had always carried when she was trying to prove a point. She wasn't here to argue, wasn't here to rewrite the story of their marriage into something it had never been. But beneath her words, between every hesitation, every moment she avoided looking directly at him, the truth was there. She had walked away believing she was making the right choice. She had left without looking back, convinced that she was moving towards something better, something she deserved. And now, standing in front of him, she wasn't so sure anymore. Daniel listened, but he didn't let himself feel. He had spent too many nights drowning in the weight of what had happened, too many mornings forcing himself to move forward when everything inside him had wanted to sink. She wasn't here because she missed him. She wasn't here because she had suddenly realized she had made a mistake. She was here because she hadn't expected him to move on. Because for the first time, she was feeling the weight of the emptiness she had created. When she finally stopped talking, the silence between them stretched, heavy with everything neither of them had said. Daniel didn't respond. He didn't need to. The past had already spoken for itself. Julia exhaled softly, nodding to herself as if accepting something she hadn't wanted to admit. Without another word, she turned and walked away, disappearing down the hall and out of sight. Daniel stood there for a long time, staring at the empty space where she had been. And for the first time since all of this had started, he felt absolutely nothing at all. Daniel stood in the doorway for a long time after Julia disappeared down the hall, staring at the empty space she had left behind. He had expected to feel something, anger, satisfaction, closure, but instead there was only silence. Just a deep, unwavering calm. The past had finally settled in its rightful place, and for the first time, it didn't hurt. For months, he had thought about this moment. He had imagined Julia coming back, filled with regret, realizing what she had lost. He had convinced himself that if it ever happened, he would be ready, that he would have the perfect words, the final speech that would make her understand the pain she had caused. But now, faced with the reality of it, he realized something unexpected. He didn't need her to understand. He didn't need to prove anything. She had already done that herself. She had walked away believing she was making the right choice. She had left their life behind, certain that she was heading towards something better. And now, she was the one looking back. But there was nothing left for her to find. Days passed, and Julia didn't reach out again. The messages stopped. The silence stretched. And yet, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't finished. The past had a way of clawing its way back when least expected, lingering just beneath the surface, waiting for a moment of weakness. He had spent too much time rebuilding himself to let it catch him off guard. It wasn't until Claire invited him to an art gallery downtown that he realized just how deep Julia's presence still ran beneath the surface of his life. The night was supposed to be simple, just a quiet evening together, something light, something easy. Claire had found a small, local gallery that was hosting an exhibit, and Daniel had agreed to go without hesitation. With Claire, there was no pressure, no expectations. She wasn't trying to fix him or force him to be someone he wasn't ready to be. She was simply there, existing beside him, and for the first time in years, he felt like he wasn't carrying everything alone. The gallery was crowded, filled with soft murmurs of conversation and the occasional clinking of wine glasses. They moved through the exhibit at a leisurely pace, weaving between groups of people, stopping occasionally to admire a particular piece or share an amused comment about some of the more abstract displays. It felt normal, easy, like he was part of the world again, no longer weighed down by the past. And then, in an instant, everything shifted. He felt it before he saw it. That strange, almost instinctive awareness of being watched. Attention in the air, subtle but undeniable. The moment he turned, he understood why. Julia was there. She stood across the room, dressed impeccably as always, her posture relaxed, her expression composed. But Daniel knew her too well. He saw the way her fingers lightly traced the stem of her wine glass, the way her gaze lingered just a fraction too long before she looked away, the way she tilted her head slightly as if testing something. She wasn't here for the art. She was here for him. She wasn't alone. Her polished, well-dressed date stood beside her, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back, a perfectly practiced gesture of possession. But Julia wasn't focused on him. She was watching Daniel, her attention sharp, unwavering. She was waiting. Claire, unaware of the silent war happening between past and present, gently touched Daniel's arm, drawing his attention back to the moment. She pointed to a painting nearby, making an offhand comment that made him chuckle. It was so simple, so natural, and yet, as he glanced back toward Julia, he saw it, the slight falter in her carefully maintained expression. For the first time, she was seeing what she had walked away from. Not a broken man, not someone waiting in the ruins of their past, but someone who had moved forward without her. And she wasn't ready for it. The moment stretched between them, unspoken, but undeniable. Julia had spent months pretending to be unaffected, pretending that her choices had been the right ones. But here she was, standing in a crowded room, watching him like she was still waiting for something. Daniel didn't give it to her. Instead, he turned back to Claire, his attention fully on her, the past finally nothing more than a whisper in the background. He didn't need closure. He didn't need an apology. He had already won. But Julia wasn't ready to accept that. Later that night, after the gallery, after dinner, after Claire had kissed him goodnight and left him standing at his door with a feeling that was warm and real in a way he hadn't known in years, another message arrived. This one was different. Julia had made a mistake. But this time, she didn't just say it. She asked if they could meet. Daniel sat in the quiet of his apartment, staring at the words. He could ignore it. He could block her number. He could leave things as they were, letting her regret fester, allowing her to sit in the space she had created for herself. But instead, after a long moment, he picked up his phone and sent a single response. A time, a location. The next evening, he met her at a small cafe, one they used to go to years ago when they had first been married. She was already there when he arrived, sitting by the window, fingers curled around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. She looked up the moment he stepped inside, and for the first time since she had reappeared in his life, she looked nervous. She had expected him to ignore her. He didn't sit down. He didn't need to. She started to speak, but he cut her off with nothing more than a look. There was nothing left to say. Whatever she wanted, whatever realization had finally come crashing down on her, was hers to carry alone. He told her goodbye, and then he left. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't filled with grand speeches or lingering glances. It was just over, for real this time, as he stepped outside, breathing in the cool evening air. A weight that had once felt unbearable now felt non-existent. Julia had been his past, but she wasn't his future. And for the first time since she had walked away, he was perfectly okay with that.